Random House Audio presents Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt by H.W. Brands. Read for you by Patrick Egan. Part 1. Swimming to Health, 1882 to 1928. Warren Delano spoiled all his children, but Sarah especially. Delano was a New Bedforder, who, like some others of that intrepid seaport, became a China merchant, which in the mid-19th century meant he dealt in opium. He amassed a fortune in the East and retired to a handsome estate on the Hudson River, where Sarah was born in 1854. Yet the panic of 1857 caught Delano out, and he found himself on the verge of ruin. He returned to China, redoubled his energies, and sold more opium than ever. He fetched his family from America and settled them in Hong Kong, where they lived in oriental opulence. Sarah's worldly education continued when the family returned home. Though legal, the opium trade wasn't respectable, and after Delano decided he'd accumulated enough to weather future downturns, he worked himself away from the business. The family took various routes home. Sarah sailed with a brother and sister to Singapore and then Egypt, where the Suez Canal was under construction. They visited France and England before crossing the Atlantic to America. Along the way, if not earlier, she discovered that travel agreed with her. And during the next decade, she returned to China and France, lived in Germany, and transited the completed Suez Canal. By the time she finally resettled into life along the Hudson, she felt herself a person apart. Few of her neighbors had seen so much of the world. Almost none of her contemporaries had partaken of such exotic experiences. She might not have said she was too good for the neighborhood, but her father said it on her behalf. Warren Delano took special pains to protect his daughter from the young men of the Hudson Valley. The military academy at West Point comprised the closest collection of bachelor males. The cadets found Sarah, who had grown into a tall, slender, self-composed beauty, most enchanting. They came courting, only to be rebuffed by Sarah's father, who understood that West Point, which provided a free education to young men clever and pushy enough to win the approval of their state's elected officials, appealed to the ambitious but impecunious among the nation's emerging manhood, precisely the sort from whom Sarah should be protected. Warren Delano had other suspicions of his daughter's suitors. As a staunch Republican, he distrusted individuals of the opposite persuasion. "I will not say that all Democrats are horse thieves," he declared in a moment of magnanimity, "but it would seem that all horse thieves are Democrats." But one day Sarah accepted a dinner invitation from an old friend. During her peripatetic childhood, Sarah had lived in New York City for a time and become close to Anna Roosevelt, called Bammy, also called Bai, the older sister of Theodore Roosevelt, the future president. Brilliant but afflicted by a spinal ailment, Bammy was, like Sarah, a spinster in progress, and her widowed mother hosted a party for her and her sister Corinne. Mrs. Roosevelt was playing matchmaker that evening and had also invited James Roosevelt, a fifth cousin of Bammy once removed. The Roosevelts had nothing against distant cousins marrying, as events would reveal, and Mrs. Roosevelt may have been thinking of pairing Bammy with James. But James saw only Sarah. He never took his eyes off of her and kept talking to her the whole time, Mrs. Roosevelt recalled. A Delano-Roosevelt match wasn't an obvious one. James was 51 and Sarah 25. James had a son, James Jr., called Rosie, just 6 months younger than Sarah, and James was a Democrat. Yet if James was old enough to be Sarah's father, that stood him well in the eyes of Sarah's actual father. Warren Delano had done business with James Roosevelt's partners and knew James from clubs they had in common. James's years promised stability in a relationship, James's wealth allayed concerns about fortune-seeking. As for his politics, a series of visits by James to the Delano home opened Warren's eyes. "James Roosevelt is the first person who has made me realize that a Democrat can be a gentleman," he said later, still marveling at the thought. When James Roosevelt requested of Warren Delano permission to marry his daughter, and Delano assented, Sarah accepted the proposal with pleasure. A mere 100 guests witnessed the exchange of vows at the Delano home in October 1880. The couple departed that afternoon for the short carriage ride to Springwood, James Roosevelt's estate at Hyde Park. A month later, the honeymoon began in earnest, when the newlyweds left for Europe on a grand tour that lasted most of a year. Sarah doted on her husband, but even more on the son she gave him. Fittingly, for one who would end his life as the arbiter of Europe's fate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was conceived on the continent, perhaps in Paris, where James's father and dozens of Delanos met the honeymooners and occupied an entire floor of the Hôtel du Rhin. The couple returned home in plenty of time to ready themselves and the Hyde Park house for its new occupant. "At 8:45, my Sally had a splendid large baby boy," James Roosevelt wrote in the family diary for January 30th, 1882. "He weighs 10 pounds without clothes." Franklin's infancy was unremarkable in certain respects. Weaned at 12 months, walking at 16, he was neither precocious nor slow. His first words were "Mama" and "Papa," apparently in that order. He added "Mammy" for the nurse who tended to the less appealing aspects of child-rearing. Sarah bore James no other children, almost certainly, considering the ease with which she conceived Franklin, by her choice. Consequently, Franklin grew up without live-in siblings, half-brother Rosie, Sarah's contemporary, having long since left home. But he never lacked for people about the house. In fact, in keeping with upper-class custom in America at the time, he saw more of the help than he did of his parents. Sarah and James refused to let the responsibilities of parenthood impinge on their active social lives. They entertained their Hudson Valley neighbors and were entertained in turn. They dropped down to New York City, sometimes taking Franklin and his nurse, and sometimes leaving them home. Franklin wasn't yet 3 in the fall of 1884 when James, Sarah, Franklin, Mammy, and their housekeeper crossed the Atlantic to England, where Franklin, Mammy, and the housekeeper remained, at Tunbridge Wells, while James and Sarah proceeded to France and Germany. After several weeks at various spas, Franklin's parents came back to England, and the family spent the winter there. They didn't return to America until the spring, more than half a year after embarking. Subsequent journeys followed a similar pattern. James, already suffering from the heart ailment that would kill him, found particular relief at the spa at Bad Nauheim, north of Frankfurt. His and Sarah's visits to Nauheim became annual affairs, and until Franklin went off to school, at the advanced age of 14, he often accompanied his father and mother. He spent enough time in Germany to acquire moderate proficiency in the language, a facility he put to good use decades later. Like his mother and her generation of Delanos, he became as comfortable at sea as on land, and as familiar with the countries of Europe as with his own. The James Roosevelts discovered Campobello Island, just off Maine, on the Bay of Fundy, the year after Franklin was born. Friends recommended it, James and Sarah and Franklin visited it, and James and Sarah decided to build a cottage there. Upon its completion, months at Campobello became a summer ritual for the family. A central part of that ritual was sailing. Franklin crewed for his father until he was tall enough to see over the tiller, at which point he often took the helm. The winds in the Bay of Fundy could be daunting, even in summer, and the tides, among the highest in the world, challenged the sharpest sailor. Franklin thrived on the tests. Sailing and the sea absorbed him. He consumed books about boats and the feats of great mariners. He doodled sloops and ketches in the margins of the work he did for his tutors.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?